The City of Richmond, Chesapeake Bay, a late evening in the 1950s, somewhere between Baltimore and Norfolk. Jean Haviland, a young woman traveling on the Old Bay Line's overnight crossing, stood in the corridor outside her cabin with her hand on a door that would not open. This was not, on the face of it, a dramatic problem. It was a stuck door on a steamship, the kind of small, specific mechanical failure that happened on vessels that worked the same route every night of the year, in all weather, for decades at a stretch. A steward could have been summoned. Jean had not yet summoned one. She was still, at the moment the door refused to yield, simply standing in a corridor on a moving ship over the Chesapeake Bay, working a problem that was not yet beyond working on her own. It was at this point that a young man, Ken, came along the corridor and offered to help. The door opened. They exchanged whatever words two strangers exchange when one has just solved a small, specific problem for the other. They were on the same ship, going the same direction, with the Chesapeake Bay on all sides and a crossing that would not reach Norfolk until morning. They had, between the stuck door and the Norfolk pier, the better part of a night. They dated. They married. They had, as a documented account from the Baltimore maritime community that knew them both describes it, a long, wonderful life together. They became ship and shipwreck experts, both of them, building careers and a home in Baltimore's Roland Park neighborhood around the water that had, on one specific crossing of the City of Richmond, put them in the same corridor at the same moment, with a door that would not open. What did an overnight crossing on the Old Bay Line give two strangers that a road, a train, or an airplane, for all of their speed and convenience, could not have given them in the same way, on the same evening, between the same two cities? What Jean and Ken were both aboard that evening was a 277-foot steel-hulled overnight steamer that had been running the Baltimore to Norfolk route since 1911, 40-plus years of the same fixed daily schedule, one sailing north each evening and one south, the City of Richmond and the City of Norfolk passing each other somewhere in the dark of the Chesapeake Bay on every crossing, night after night, in all weather. The City of Richmond accommodated more than 300 passengers on 3 decks, with cargo on 2 more. She was built at Sparrows Point, Maryland, by the same regional economy that built the rest of the Old Bay Line's fleet, for the specific, documented purpose of carrying people overnight across a body of water that the railroads could not, by the geography of the Chesapeake and its tributaries, cross directly. What the ship offered any passenger who boarded in Baltimore at evening was not simply transportation. It was the specific social architecture of a vessel that had 12 hours to fill between the departure whistle and the 6:30 arrival at the Norfolk Pier. 12 hours that the Old Bay Line had built, across more than a century of operation, around dinner, entertainment, and a ballroom, because 12 hours on the Chesapeake Bay was too long to treat as merely transit and too short to treat as a voyage. The line's documented reputation, built over 122 years, was for genteel service and fine dining, serving Chesapeake Bay specialties, food and service, that arrived at the table with the specific authority of a company that understood it was not simply feeding passengers, but giving them a reason to linger. A passenger who wanted to be alone had the stateroom and the rail. A passenger who wanted company had the dining saloon, the ballroom, the bar, the horse racing on the salon floor. A passenger who got stuck outside a cabin door in a corridor had a stranger who came along and offered to help. What did the specific architecture of an overnight crossing, 12 hours between cities, a fixed social world in the darkness, no way off and no way past the Chesapeake until morning, actually require of two strangers in the same corridor, and what did it make possible that no shorter or faster crossing could have? Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the American excursion boat trip between 1900 and 1980, what the steamer or the dayliner or the coastal tour boat actually offered, what the crew and the regular passengers built into the trip over years of repetition, and what families were actually getting from time on the water that the destination on either end could not give them alone. Not nostalgia for an old photograph of a steamer. The documented social meaning of a trip that a generation of American families built into their summers on purpose. Even if you never sailed the Old Bay Line, what it gave two strangers, a night on open water with nowhere else to be, a stuck cabin door, and a ship going the same direction, is something no highway has ever been built to provide. And if your family ever sailed the Old Bay Line, put it in the comments. Did your family ever take the overnight Chesapeake Bay steamer? And do you remember a meeting, a conversation, or a moment that started on that ship and lasted longer than the crossing? Next time on this channel, the Puget Sound Mosquito Fleet, the small ferries that carried an entire Washington state region to work every morning until a single bridge ended them all. Back to the rail. The corridor outside Jean Haviland's cabin was not, on an overnight steamer like the City of Richmond, a space designed for transit. It was a space designed for the specific social world of a vessel that had 12 hours to fill, a world in which passengers moved between their stateroom, the dining saloon, the ballroom, the bar, and the deck rail, and in which the corridor was simply the space that connected all of these, traversed by anyone going anywhere on the ship. A passenger who stood in that corridor for 5 minutes, working a stuck door, would be passed by other passengers in various states of the evening's progression, some coming from dinner, some heading to the ballroom, some returning from the deck rail with the Chesapeake Bay still in their eyes. This was the specific social condition of an overnight crossing, a contained world, moving, with a fixed passenger list, and no arrivals or departures until morning. The ballroom on the main deck and the bar beside it were not optional evening diversions built onto an otherwise efficient vessel. They were the City of Richmond's entire social argument, the reason that 12 hours on the Chesapeake Bay could be a genuinely different experience from 12 hours on a train, where the social world was limited by the linear geography of a passenger car and the expectation that everyone aboard was simply waiting to arrive. On the City of Richmond, no one was simply waiting to arrive. They had 12 hours, the Chesapeake Bay, a dining saloon, a ballroom, and a fixed community of several hundred strangers who would all be, by the time the Norfolk Pier appeared in the gray morning, something more than strangers. The ship made this specific, documentable social transformation a matter of course. It had been making it, on every crossing, for more than 40 years before Jean Haviland stood in that corridor. What specific conditions did an overnight crossing on the Chesapeake Bay create between strangers, conditions that no faster form of travel between Baltimore and Norfolk had ever managed to generate, and that no faster form of travel was ever designed to? Jean and Ken had, after the door opened, the specific and documented conditions of an Old Bay Line overnight crossing in front of them. Dinner in a brightly lit dining saloon, where the service was the specific, practiced kind that came from a crew that ran this crossing every night and had learned its passengers with the patience of repetition. Horse racing on the salon floor after dinner, with wooden horses and dice, and a purser who ran the whole thing with the smooth authority of a man who had done it hundreds of times. Bingo. The ballroom. The bar. And, at whatever hour, two people who had just met on a ship chose to leave the evening behind, the deck and the bay. None of this was engineered toward the specific outcome of Jean and Ken's meeting. The dining saloon was not designed to create introductions. The ballroom was not designed to produce marriages. The Old Bay Line had built these amenities because 12 hours on the Chesapeake Bay required them, because passengers who were not engaged were restless passengers, and because restless passengers did not return. The ship was designed to fill 12 hours, in a way that felt like something more than transit, and filling 12 hours in a way that felt like something more than transit, on a fixed passenger list with no way off until morning, created the specific social conditions in which two strangers who had met in a corridor could, by the time the Norfolk pier appeared, have talked long enough to know whether they wanted to see each other again. Walter Lord, the man who would write A Night to Remember, the definitive account of the Titanic, and whose grandfather had been the Old Bay Line's president, understood something about ships that the rest of his generation was learning from the automobile, that a crossing which takes long enough to matter is different, in kind, from a crossing which takes only as long as it has to. What had Jean and Ken found in 12 hours on the City of Richmond over the Chesapeake Bay that no shorter crossing between the same two cities had the time to build? Jean and Ken Haviland went on to build their married life around the water. Documented accounts from the Baltimore maritime community that knew them described two people who had turned the interest that began on the City of Richmond into careers, ship and shipwreck experts, both of them working from their home in Roland Park, Baltimore. Jean was known, across years of correspondence with divers and researchers around the country, for answering every inquiry in longhand, for the quality of her handwriting, for her willingness to help anyone who sent a stamped return envelope and a genuine question. A man who had done research at their home remembered the visits. Another correspondent wrote that he still had Jean's letters in his files, written in longhand. A third, she had a beautiful handwriting. This is the specific, documented legacy of a stuck cabin door on an overnight crossing of the Chesapeake Bay. Two people who became, in the Baltimore maritime community, the kind of people others describe with the specific warmth reserved for those who were genuinely useful to others. Not famous, not celebrated in the way that ocean liner captains are celebrated, but known, trusted, helpful, and missed. They were wonderful people, and I miss them, one Baltimore correspondent wrote. Ken and Jean Haviland were very good friends, and we had many good times together, wrote another. The City of Richmond had not been trying to produce this outcome. It had been trying to get 300 people from Baltimore to Norfolk overnight. The specific, documented outcome, a marriage, 2 careers, decades of correspondence, a Roland Park home, letters in longhand that people kept for years, was a byproduct of the simple operational fact that an overnight crossing has enough time in it for 2 strangers to become something more than that. What did Jean and Ken Haviland's story reveal about the specific, uncountable social outcomes of a vessel that spent 40-plus years putting hundreds of people together in a contained world for 12 hours, night after night, between the same 2 cities? Before you can understand what the City of Richmond was giving Jean and Ken Haviland in the late 1950s, you need to understand what was already happening to the world the ship belonged to. By the mid-1950s, the Old Bay Line was documented specifically as the last of their kind in the nation. Every comparable overnight nightboat service in the United States had already ceased operations. The Fall River Line had been scrapped in 1937. The D and C line between Detroit and Cleveland had folded in 1951. The City of Richmond and her running mate, the City of Norfolk, were, by the time Jean and Ken met aboard one of them, the last 2 overnight passenger steamers in regular service under the American flag. This was not a boast. It was a specific, documented statement about isolation. The Old Bay Line had survived not because it was particularly profitable, and not because it had found a way to compete with the automobile on the automobile's own terms, but because the specific geography of the Chesapeake Bay, wide, dotted with tributaries, resistant to direct overland crossing in a way that Long Island Sound or the Hudson River was not, had kept the overnight boat genuinely practical for longer than comparable routes elsewhere. The railway could not go directly from Baltimore to Norfolk. The drive, even by the late 1950s, was long enough that an overnight boat that arrived at 6:30 in the morning was a reasonable business choice. But by the late 1950s, The airplane was making that calculation unreliable. Baltimore to Norfolk took 45 minutes in the air. Passenger travel on the old Bay Line steamers was put on hold in the fall of 1961, and the company made the decision that spring to phase out freight as well. The City of Norfolk made her final run on April 13, 1962. What does it mean that Jean and Ken Haviland met aboard the City of Richmond in the last years of the last overnight steamship service in the United States, and that the ship that put them in the same corridor no longer existed by the time most people would learn what it had given them? The City of Richmond outlasted the old Bay Line by 2 years, but only barely. After the company ceased operations in 1962, she sat idle at Pier 3, Pratt Street, one of the grand old ladies of the Chesapeake, as a 1963 Baltimore Sun caption described the 2 remaining steamers at their berth. She was sold in 1963 to investors who had, in the specific optimism of that moment about the future of leisure tourism, a plan for her. She would be towed to St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands, converted into a floating restaurant, hotel, and nightclub. It was a plan that said something specific about how the world had come to see an overnight passenger steamer by 1963, not as a form of transport, which she clearly was no longer, but as a scenic platform, a novelty, a floating space whose value was now entirely in what it looked like rather than where it went. The City of Richmond left Baltimore on tow on August 13, 1964, with a crew of 6. She spent 3 weeks in Norfolk. She resumed the journey towards St. Thomas on September 23, 1964, under tow by a second tugboat after the first broke down. The vessels departed North Carolina's coast on October 3rd. 2 days later, on October 5, 1964, they ran into seas left by Hurricane Hilda, a Category 4 hurricane that had just ravaged the Gulf Coast. 10 to 14-foot swells, strong winds, a leaking bilge. The 1,923-ton steamer heeled to port. The crew of 6 abandoned ship. The City of Richmond sank off the North Carolina coast, a few hundred miles from the waters she had worked for half a century. She had not made it to St. Thomas. She had not become a restaurant. She was, instead, exactly where ships that have been worn to their limits by honest work tend to end up, on the bottom. What does it mean that the ship that put Jean and Ken Haviland in the same corridor, and in doing so produced a marriage, 2 careers, and decades of correspondence on the Chesapeake Bay's shipwrecks, became, in the end, a shipwreck herself? Jean and Ken Haviland built their life from a stuck cabin door on a ship that no longer existed by the time anyone outside Baltimore's maritime community knew their names. The City of Richmond was already on the bottom off North Carolina by 1964. The old Bay Line itself, 122 years, the oldest steamship company under the American flag, had ended with the April 1962 docking of the City of Norfolk in Baltimore's Inner Harbor. The airplane that replaced the nightboat gave a passenger 45 minutes between Baltimore and Norfolk. It gave a ticket window, a departure gate, a seat, and an arrival time. It gave, by every reasonable measure, more efficiency than any overnight steamer had ever offered. What the airplane did not give: 12 hours on the Chesapeake Bay with a fixed passenger list and no way off until morning. A corridor outside a stuck cabin door where a stranger came along and offered to help. A dining saloon, a ballroom, a bar, horse racing on a green tarp, the Chesapeake Bay in the dark, a bay that smelled different from the ocean and different from a river, a 6:30 arrival on schedule, a schedule so precise, the records say, that a Baltimore resident could set his watch by the ship's passing. It did not give 2 strangers a reason to be in the same corridor at the same hour going the same direction, and having, between them and the Norfolk Pier, a night. Jean Haviland corresponded for years with researchers, divers, and maritime historians around the country. In longhand, with a beautiful handwriting, with a stamped return envelope, with the patience of someone who had turned a night on a ship into a life on the water's history. She helped people she would never meet find what they were looking for. When she died, people kept her letters. The city of Richmond had known what to do with two strangers in the same corridor. No airline timetable had ever thought to build in the time. If this channel is going to keep documenting what the American excursion boat trip meant to the families who chose it summer after summer, subscribe. There are more steamers, more overnight crossings, more evening cruises, and more crowded departure docks that were the best night of somebody's whole year, and were never described that way at the time because they didn't need to be. Even if you never sailed the old Bay Line, what it gave two strangers, a night on open water with nowhere else to be, a stuck cabin door, and a ship going the same direction, is something no highway has ever been built to provide. And if you have a memory of a night boat, a stateroom, a rail you stood at in the dark, or a crossing that started something that lasted longer than the crossing, put it in the comments. Did your family ever sail the old Bay Line, and do you remember a meeting, a conversation, or a moment that started on that ship?